Thank you for joining us here on Vital for Colorado Radio. I'm your on-air producer, Jon Ekstrom. Joining me, as always, is our chairman and CEO, Peter Moore, also an attorney with Robinson Waters and Odorcio.
John, thanks a lot. I'm glad to see you again, and we do the show twice a month. We've been doing it for quite some time. I think over 70 shows at this point, so that'd be over 35 months, 3 years.
Yeah.
That's a bit of math for you.
Perfect. Math, my strong suit, as always, as a radio host and communications consultant.
Yeah.
But we're pleased to have join us today Greg Avery, reporter with the Denver Business Journal. Greg, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me over. It's fun to be on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Greg, you are sort of new to the energy beat, new-ish, I would say. Is that fair?
It is fair. I mean, it's a complex beat. I've covered it for a few months, and it's enough to know that there's a lot I still don't know.
Well, what's amazing to me is I've grown up around this industry my entire life. My father was in oil and gas. I've worked in it myself. The more that I understand about it, the deeper and more complex it gets. Which, have you found that to be true as well?
I have a background having covered technology industries and whatnot, and they do not corner the market on complexity. Oil and gas is a fascinating business, and other forms of energy, solar, wind, it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah,
and changing quite a bit.
You know, many of the service companies, in particular, we've had them in to talk to us, and they just flat out view their companies as being technology companies, and the amount of technology, especially since 2014, has changed things. Is fairly amazing. So I think your background is perfect because you probably understand more than most when there is a technological advancement and what the possibilities are.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to learn about the overlap and the things I've covered in the past and what's going on around in the oil fields today. It's pretty fascinating.
Let's talk about your background a little bit. Although you may be new to the energy beat, you've been in the newspaper biz almost 20 years, I see here.
That makes me feel old.
Well, no, 20 years is a youngster around here, at least as far as I'm concerned. But why don't you just give a thumbnail sketch of your background so people know your newspaper experience?
Yeah, professionally, I've been around Colorado, northern Colorado, my whole professional career. Started out, graduated from CU Boulder and covered things in Greeley and Longmont. Yeah. Internship up in Fort Collins, that was fun. And then more recently, prior to the DBJ, covering City Hall, and then gradually drifting into covering the business community for the Boulder Daily Camera. And then Neil Westergaard, the former executive editor at the DBJ, lured me away to come cover technology and aerospace down at the DBJ. And since then, it's been a fun ride here in Denver, covering a lot of really interesting stuff.
Could you just give just a broad comment? I have my thoughts, but the environment of the Boulder Daily Camera versus the Denver Business Journal, I view them as totally different types of newspapers. But maybe that's not true. I don't know.
They are very different, but it's culturally, it has less to do with the cities than it does just the niche publication versus a general interest readership. I mean, the business desk of the Boulder Daily Camera covered things from very much looking from a consumer interest, looking from the outside into the business community to some degree, whereas the Denver Business Journal is writing about the business community for the business community, and it's a different perspective. It in some ways helps us with access. I think business leaders are more apt to know that our readership wants the complexities of entrepreneurship and told and that kind of stuff. So we benefit some from being at the DBJ with having an element of kind of trust from the business community that dailies don't always get.
Well, to give you props, almost everybody that I know reads the DBJ fairly carefully, and we're not reading the dailies much anymore. But we do like the DBJ, and the DBJ does a very good job in Denver, I think.
It's a good company to work for. I think, as we were talking before we came on air, it's part of American City Business Journals, and it's a parent company that takes its mission of covering business pretty seriously, which is great.
Well, and what's interesting to me is it stands in contrast to sort of what you see, because DBJ is very financially healthy, right, and it continues to grow.
Yeah, it is. We have not suffered the big hemorrhage of readership that you see dailies have. It's a very different business model for niche business publications compared to, an urban metro daily, and it's helped us be pretty solid. I mean, the journalism industry, the media industry is changing, and it's difficult for everybody. We're not immune to that. It's the shifts in advertising and things like that. But we're definitely on more solid ground than dailies that have ownership interests that are trying to cut costs at an incredible pace. I mean, we've seen that in the dailies around Colorado.
Sure.
It makes it difficult for them to cover things, even with really talented people on their staff.
Yeah, they can only be in so many places at once, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So Colorado, 2019, energy beat. Not much happening. Huh?
No, it's sleepy.
It's sleepy. It's
I thought I came on last year thinking 2018 might be the most fever pitch time to possibly step into the beat, and that might not be the case.
Well, I remember I started working for an E&P company in 2010, where I think back on that now, relatively quiet. And I thought once 2012 hit and there was the frack ban in Longmont, I thought to myself, it cannot get worse than this. And here we are 7 years later, and the conversations have only accelerated and intensified. Yeah, how's it been, Greg?
It's been a whirlwind. It's been very interesting. I, as a journalist in the area and resident of the area, I've always found the tension over oil and gas fascinating to watch from the outside in, and just covering it. It's even more complex and engaging than as a journalist. There's just no end to the storytelling potential. Sure. And there's a lot of consequence to it as well, which is what makes everybody interested in it.
Yeah.
To somewhat set the stage, and these might not be three good poll stars, but think of the time period of really 2012 to about 2017 efforts by many of the northern communities north of Denver, essentially to enact various moratoria, which efforts were by and large not successful, but they were fought in the courts. 2018, an effort to have a 2,500-foot radius setback, or a 5,000-foot circle, which some said would have covered, depending upon the area of the state you're in, over 85 or 90%. And then that was defeated, but an awful lot of people voted for it. I don't know what the exact numbers were. It was either 43% or...
It was somewhere between 43 and 45%.
That's a lot of people. But there was that election, and folks call that Proposition 112. And then very recently, just in January of 2019, closely watched Colorado Court of Appeals case called the Martinez case that looked at the balancing of factors that need to be followed by the Department of Natural Resources and COGCC. A ruling was issued by the Colorado Supreme Court that, as I recall the decision, basically found that there needs to be a balancing of what's in the COGC statute. So those are three major developments, I think, somewhat. And to get back to the moratorium and the setback, the underlying issue, I think, is a desire for greater local control. So I guess you can probably summarize the intentions of both of those actions as local control issues. So maybe I should mention that too. And here we are, and I don't know if we're a third of the way through the legislature, and
yeah, that seems right.
And the legislators are busy working on bills, and I understand they keep them in their pockets until they're about to announce them. Some people really don't know what's in the bills.
Yeah, they certainly are in this session. It's
they're in session.
Often, as reporters, we hear drafts circulating and things like that well in advance of the session starting. And when it comes to the energy issue, oil and gas in particular, there wasn't advanced draft circulating, so there's been a lot of discussion about what should be in the bill, and there's going to be one.
And there's and I think the oil and gas industry wants a bill. I mean, they want certainty and they want to know. So there's a common desire for there to be a bill, and there will be a bill. But just starting on the issue of drafts, have you seen anything, or is it just a jungle beat out there?
Well, and my colleague at Sea Lover probably has more direct contact with people putting things on paper, but I've heard said, I mean, and as Ed recently covered, there's a lot of talk about how to how to get local control, more local control into state law, as far as local communities, cities, and counties able to have more say-so over how oil and gas development occurs than they currently have, because the COGCC kind of reigns supreme. There are surface-level things that cities and counties can do now as far as the appearance and placement on properties and things like that. But what exactly gets proposed as a form of local control is unclear still to me. We hear some things, but it's not clear what's going to end up in the final draft. And it seems as though the Democrats, who are in the majority, all three branches, seem to be cautiously crafting a bill that they believe will actually work, as opposed to putting out a statement bill that if it gets shot down, they at least made a statement. That's not what they seem to be going after. They seem to be after real change.
Well, what's interesting to me, and I'm curious of your take on this, because as a reporter, I'm sure you've talked to some local government officials. We had Mayor of Johnstown, Scott James, on this show at one point, and he didn't have the staff necessarily to regulate oil and gas to the local level. Right. There are no petroleum geologists typically employed, or reservoir engineers, or some of the technical aspects that go into oil and gas from a regulatory perspective. Have you spoken to any local elected officials about their thoughts on this?
No, I haven't, actually. I've focused mainly on the business community. I have heard testimony before the COGCC about different things going on out in Adams County, and places where Conoco has been talking with local communities. And there's a lot of expertise that's needed to assess what is correct about drilling plans and things like that. But there are communities such as Boulder County that want to have more say on the surface, and
sure.
And it's going to be interesting to see how the legislature splits that baby, because most communities and most counties, I think, don't have the expertise and don't claim the kind of expertise.
Many don't have the desire to
right.
take that on, in addition to their typical day-to-day duties of running the county or running the city or wherever. So balancing that, I think, will be interesting.
It will. I mean, we see a lot of tension in places like Broomfield, and but just interestingly, in the last few weeks, we've seen the town of Erie, which has a very vocal set of residents about drilling. It's on the edge of the Denver-Julesburg Basin, where a lot of oil and gas activity is. And you've seen the town, which essentially has a very vocal community concerned about drilling operations in their community. We've seen them reach agreements with operators for drilling plans that fit the future long-term economic development of the community, and the community is proactively going out and reaching land deals and agreements with big operators, trying to make sure that all the needs are met and that things can, development can occur both for the oil and gas companies and for the community. So it's kind of a lot of the fighting that goes on in terms of in the media and online and things like that misses some of the complexities of what governments are able
Sure.
to do when they sit down and talk.
And for some of those, and I'm thinking of places like Broomfield in particular, and a couple E&P companies I'm thinking of, they reach agreements, and there's still a controversy, is that now the government, now the local government's in the bag, as opposed to the state being in the bag, and it's still not good enough. And I'm sitting there going, holy cow, these are your guys.
But it was interesting. Broomfield in particular, there's a lot of residential dissatisfaction with how things played out, because the operators reached an operator agreement with the local government before the community had changed the charter of the town. And
right.
There's a lot of disappointment that the one operator that's going to operate in town doesn't have the charter changes applied to it. And it's kind of like, well, the operator's agreement had already been reached by the time the vote had, at least it was far enough along.
That's the example I was thinking of.
Yeah,
because I was obvious.
But it's a very complex situation for local governments when they have their constituents trying to figure out what more they can do. And I don't know how the legislature is going to craft a law that balances the legal interests that operators have and the pressure that local governments are under to do something to make drilling operations more palatable, or in the case of some residents, they just want it to go away and never occur.
Right. Is it tricky for you from a coverage perspective, given that you are covering this through a business lens, right? I mean, it's the Denver Business Journal. But I found in your coverage, you're talking to both operators and activists on the other side. Do you ever have accusations of bias, and how do you navigate through that?
Well, I think over time, if you're a reporter engaged on complicated issues, somebody's going to accuse you of bias somewhere. And
right.
I feel like our duty is to tell as close to the whole truth as we can every time we write a story, but it's not always possible to cover every nuance. These are complex situations. So
right, you don't have unlimited real estate to do this.
Exactly. There's only so much time and attention people have to read, and there's only so much space I have to write, and things do get left out sometimes. But by and large, I think the publication is seen as an honest
That's fair.
Truth teller, as a fair truth teller about this stuff. I mean, yeah, I think there are activists who'd like to see less of the business rationale for why things are the way they are reflected in our coverage, but it's the Business Journal.
It's right out there in front. It's in the title.
And conversely, operators. I talk to operators, and they understand that there are some very vocal activists often on the other side of these questions in certain communities, especially, and reflecting what they're saying is our obligation as well, because when it affects, for us, it's through the business lens. It's when it affects the business community. So the fact that somebody has a rally is not necessarily something we would cover, but the fact that activists are succeeding in maybe changing the way in which operators have to consider approaching a certain community or a certain type of proposition, that's when we say this is something our business readers would like to know about.
Yeah.
It's pretty hard to predict. I think, especially from my perspective of just looking at it for 5 years from the viewpoint of Auto for Colorado, which is about our lifespan, I think there's a great hunger for peace, clear rules, and I'm very much an optimist, meaning that I believe that technology is changing so fast that so many of the objections that are not even factual anymore, because they've been solved, they've been fixed, and the remaining ones can be fixed. And so I think I'm hoping for that kind of solution. But when some of the objections are just as simple, and I said, well, I don't really care what you say. I want to keep it in the ground. That's my starting point, my ending point. And I said, well, you can't do that. It's not feasible. And nobody that's talking about this says it is. You can change the percentages and doing that, but you can't just keep it in the ground. It's owned by somebody. So how do you deal with, and I don't want to really call them activists because I don't want to pick on anybody, but somebody that has that perspective. And there clearly are people that say, matter of fact, some national organizations, I think Sierra Club has a work group that's been out there for more than 10 years, and it says on the website, our goal is to keep hydrocarbons in the ground and not use them. So let's use Sierra Club. I guess somebody would feel bad about that, and that really is its position. What do you do with that?
As a reporter?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess you report on it, but
I mean, it's because it's funny.
I guess I was really trying to get to reaching peace and some sort of accommodation, which I think the goal of the legislature in this session is partly that. Is that the industry wants a set of rules that are predictable and reliable, and they can exploit the resources. The local governments want greater degree of local control. Everybody wants safety, and some of the local residents would perhaps not want it in their backyard.
And I think the industry now, even having won landmark court case in the Martinez case that you mentioned, and won at the ballot box with Proposition 112 in November, I think the industry is still cognizant of the fact that the majority of people who work in the industry here live here. They talk to their neighbors, and they know that there are people who are even in good conscience or fair-minded people who understand the need to make use of natural resources, who are uncomfortable with the scale of operations in some circumstances. And the industry wants to try and make sure that operators and residents can live in some sort of accord with each other, and that drilling can occur in places that, and at time, or in situations that people feel comfortable about. And it did kind of, one of the bigger surprises to me in the kind of outflow of the Prop 112 victory, which was a pretty substantial victory for the industry, was the willingness to talk about compromise and changing positions on on things in general. The devil is always in the details, but the fact that the industry was willing to say, even the night that the election returns were still coming in, it was clear that they were winning, instead of crowing about the fact that voters in Colorado sided with them in a majority of them. The industry was saying, we're willing to talk if it's reasonable. And that, I think that might be some of the reason why the Democratic-controlled legislature hasn't rushed, is because they have an engaged industry willing to talk about real things. And the activist community that may be the loudest and the most extreme isn't driving this, which is kind of interesting to me to watch. And I would not have necessarily seen that.
I think it's an interesting threading the needle exercise. And I think it's indicative of a larger point. I was speaking with a different reporter who I think is still in Colorado, but in 2012 he said he used to cover the chemical industry in the Northeast, Philadelphia, that whole area, and they were going through a similar thing in the 1980s. And he said they realized they had to entirely change the way they engaged with the public, the way they engaged with elected officials, and the way they talked about their business. Because one of two things was going to happen. Either they were going to evolve, or there was going to be no longer be a chemical industry in the United States. Very similar thing kind of in Colorado here. Instead of just looking to win at the ballot box and engage in fisticuffs, it's more, look, this was an existential threat. Proposition 112 would have ended our industry in this state for all intents and purposes. But that's not to say that some of what underlies that is unreasonable. Some of it is reasonable. Let's talk. And I think it's indicative of an industry that has changed quite a bit, even over the last 6-7 years.
Yeah, and if you go up into the DJ Basin, you can see it in the way things look. I mean, there are far fewer tank batteries in some areas than there would have been a few years ago. Pipeline investment, the midstream, as the industry calls it, there's been big investments in that to try and do more tankless well site development, which for people who aren't familiar, there's not as much visible stuff on the land, and there's millions of fewer truck trips on local roads involved when you have pipelines, and that's an investment industry's made to try and do things in a way that it's not all just suburban environmental activists that are driving this. I mean, industry's doing this in areas that are still pretty rural and have a pretty accommodating relationship with local farmers and communities, and they're still making these investments to try and have less impact on the land, because they realize that having good relationships with their partners in local communities is essential to the long-term health of the industry.
If you have a centralized production facility that handles 10 wells, you have 9 fewer wells. So that's like a 90% reduction, and that's becoming very, very common in Colorado.
Well, and I think it's interesting, too, in an industry populated almost entirely by geologists and engineers, they're starting to recognize the need for a social license to operate. And, I mean, that becomes part of your technical understanding of your business, not just, reservoir and source rock and things like that, but the communities in which we operate are going to dictate the way in which we do business. Peter, why don't you, with our remaining time here in this segment, next segment we're going to talk about some of the things coming up. You recently covered forced pooling, talked about production records. There's never a dull moment here in this industry. But before we get there, Peter, would you give the plug for Vital?
Sure. Vital for Colorado is a nonprofit organization. We started in the summer of 2013. We organized ourselves around the 7 Principles Pledge. We have 88,000 Colorado citizens have now signed that pledge, over 1,000 businesses. We're run by a 15-person member board of directors. Nobody from the industry is on the board. I'm not an energy lawyer. I'm a sports lawyer. And we try to advocate and educate people about reasonable energy policy.
So go to vitalforcolorado.com. You can hear this episode along with every other episode that we've done. Under the Learn tab, videos and podcasts, we've got more with Greg Avery, reporter from the Denver Business Journal. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us here on Vital for Colorado Radio. I am Jon Ekstrom, your on-air producer, joined by Greg Avery, reporter from the Denver Business Journal, and as always, our chairman and CEO of Vital for Colorado, Peter Moore.
Welcome back. Greg, there's an interesting concept, and it's a terrible word, I think, forced pooling.
Oh, yeah.
And it's in the Colorado statutes, and I generally understand why it's there, but what's your understanding, what's your reporting on forced pooling, what it is, and why it's important and in controversy right now?
Well, it's a really important principle to oil and gas exploration, and it spilled into federal court this week, well, actually starting last week, when some mineral rights owners were not happy with the way the state oversees what's known as forced pooling. So for people who aren't in the industry and don't know, forced pooling is when mineral rights owners who own mineral acreage that's about to be included in a drilling project, if they don't want to take part in the drilling project, then maybe they don't like the lease offer that an exploration company offered them, or they just don't want to take part, as in the case of what landed in court this week. The operator can use state law to basically say, well, we're going to include your mineral rights in our drilling plan, and when we start making revenue off the wells we drill, you'll earn a royalty on it.
You're still going to get paid.
You're still going to get paid.
But a little bit less.
Right. And to some people who aren't familiar with forced pooling, it sounds really strange to think that I have, if I was a mineral owner, I'd have some property that could be put to use by somebody else against my wishes. But there are technical reasons and legal reasons that forced pooling makes a lot of sense, and most energy-producing states have some form of this, where if you, there was a period prior to 1951, I gather, I wasn't around then, but there was a period prior to 1951 in Colorado where mostly vertical wells were being drilled, obviously, back in those days, and wells drilled too close together with each other by people who were not cooperating could end up with two low-performing wells and a lot of resources left in the ground. The state had an interest in seeing natural resources developed efficiently, so they gave operators the ability to what's known as force pool, which is include the underground oil rights of somebody else if the geology dictates that the well is going to drain an area. And so an operator who has a superior ability to get a project done can force pool other rights owners into their project, but the rights owners get paid.
It's even more than just economic efficiency, is that you have fewer wells because you have one well versus two wells in your example.
Exactly.
And there are all sorts of other factors that the Department of Natural Resources balances. And private property rights and efficient extraction of the resources are two of them.
Well, and if you think about it, particularly since approximately 1999, when horizontal drilling really took off, if you have a mile-long lateral where you touch multiple mineral rights owners, if someone in the middle of that, stops a long lateral, then again you have to have multiple rigs on top of the land. That's inefficient. It's not the best way of doing things. Additionally, this allows you to continue to get paid. So it's actually a protection for the landowner.
It is.
Because, you can't, it's like, okay, well, you didn't sign on. We're going to drain this anyway, and you're not going to see any benefit from it. The law says no, that this is part of the way a drilling package works. You're going to get justly compensated for what you own.
And there's a tension in the fact that, as we've been talking about a little bit, is that drilling operations have changed quite a bit. They've evolved. And so with horizontal drilling taking off in the last decade, and particularly in the last 6 or so years, the laterals getting longer and longer underground, there are more and more rights included in a drilling area. And the drilling areas have gotten bigger in Colorado, up to 1,200, a little over 1,200 acres, which is quite a bit bigger than they used to be. So there's a lot of different rights owners being pulled into projects, and a specific project that may not have had to think about it before. So the questions, you hear a tension in the way the COGCC, when it rises to the commissioners and it's out in public hearings, you hear a little bit of tension in the way the commission tries to deal with these questions of force pooling. And issues of force pooling come up a lot between operators. I mean, this is the bread and butter of exploring for oil, is making sure, if I have mineral rights, I'm getting paid for.
Laterals, I guess you use the example of a mile. Somebody that I know that is actually drilling a well up in, I've seen records where it's 18,300 feet, and I was trying to figure out how many miles to that.
My word. So that's like 3 miles.
Yeah.
A little bit more.
Yeah.
And 2 miles is becoming more and more common in the Denver-Julesburg.
And that's the kind of technology, and
right.
And you're very knowledgeable, but I don't think you heard of an 18,000-foot lateral.
No, certainly not.
And I just learned of it last week, and I said that's more.
Well, and one thing that's worth bringing up here is, I mean, we talked about protecting the financial interest and the mineral interest of those who don't want the project, but forced pooling also prevents those who want it to happen. So let's say you have 5 mineral rights owners, and 4 of them say, yes, we want this project to happen. The 5th one says, no, I don't want it. In some states, they can shut down an entire drilling project for that.
Right.
I worked for a company that had some interest in West Virginia. West Virginia at the time had no forced pooling law. So it was really hard to put projects together, and then no one gets paid.
And different states handle it differently. I've heard forced pooling technically does not exist in Texas, but they handle the situations very differently, and
right.
It puts more emphasis on doing the upfront work with your landman, and people make more money in theory than they might in certain stages of the game here. But then projects are harder to put together. It's a very complicated, fluid situation depending on where you're operating. But in Colorado, forced pooling has been in place for
since 1951, it looks like.
Yeah, it's been a long time. And when things were vertical, it was, I think, a simpler proposition than it is today.
So how would such a good idea as forced pooling end up in federal court?
Well, it's funny because I covered a lot of land development earlier in my career, and most residential subdivisions don't. They're severed estates, and the mineral rights have been sold off by somebody a long time ago underneath these homes. But in the Wildgrass neighborhood of Broomfield, it's one of the neighborhoods, and there are a few around, that the mineral rights with each property are still attached, and there are, according to a committee of residents in Wildgrass, there are a couple hundred homeowners in that neighborhood who do not want any part of a drilling proposal that the drilling area includes their neighborhood and a neighboring subdivision in a well pad that's going to be just outside their subdivision. So they're trying to stop it, and they went to federal court basically saying we have the right to say no, leave it in the ground, and they shouldn't be able to force our mineral rights to be used at all.
Do you know in the Wildgrass example what the homeowners association did, because they would have some common areas that also would be within this area.
They do.
And I don't know, but I've heard of a few other situations where the homeowners association would say, sure, it's free money and less assessment for the homeowners and more money to fix up the pools and the yard and the walkways and tennis courts and all that kind of stuff.
Snow removal and whatever.
So I would imagine that the homeowners association, I'm just guessing, in Wildgrass said yes. Do you have any knowledge of that?
Actually, the homeowners association is part of the
lawsuit. Okay.
The lawsuit, so it's kind of an interesting situation, and because nobody I've talked to has heard of a situation quite like this.
I would have guessed they would have gone the other direction, but I guess if you have
and I think in most cases they do. This is one area where it's not like that, and it's a subdivision. It sits over old coal mines, and there's oil and gas wells throughout the property already. It's just an interesting proposition. Nobody I've talked to has heard of a situation quite like this one arising before, and it really challenges people to think about how forced pooling fits in a scenario where mineral rights owners don't even want to get paid. they just want the stuff left in the ground, and state law is not set up for that.
So the lawsuit's just been filed, and I assume nothing's going to happen anytime soon, or is it more advanced than that?
Well, there was a request for a temporary restraining order. That's why I was making headlines, and they were trying to stop drilling. That did not succeed. They actually lost, and the federal judge decided not to stop the drilling with stop drilling plans with a temporary restraining order after finding out.
That was earlier this week, wasn't it?
That was, and just yesterday, and the judge had taken witness testimony where the neighborhood was concerned that drilling was going to happen within a couple of weeks before a forced pooling hearing at the COGCC was to take place. Yesterday, the company, which is not actually directly a part of this lawsuit, that is drilling wells, extraction, oil and gas, came and said, no, we're not planning to drill till June. The forced pooling hearing should be settled by then, and the judge said, okay, if that's the sequence of events, then we'll let things go forward, but that's how it should play out. Don't drill until this hearing has happened, which sounds like what you're going to do anyway. Everybody walked away somewhat happy because the residents realized that they could at least have their day before the COGCC before any drilling rigs show up. There are some activists who are unhappy, who weren't completely happy because they did not get the temporary restraining order that would basically put a hold on drilling officially.
And this would really get more in the plans of what the lawyers for Wildgrass wanted to do, but do you have any information or knowledge what their theory was as far as posting a bond? So when you get a TRO, there needs to be a real emergency, and it's not proper when there is none, as it wasn't in this case. Well, let's say that there were a real emergency. You have to post a bond equal to the damages that'd be suffered by the company that's enjoined.
Oh, interesting. That did not come up. I don't think it got close enough to that.
That'd be fascinating. How do you do that?
That would be interesting. That would be a fascinating thing. And if
it's big money there.
Sometimes you got to be careful what you ask for.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. So it's interesting to me because we've got forced pooling here. We spent some time talking about Proposition 112. We talked about setbacks. We talked about changing the mission of the COGCC. These are all things that are either under consideration or have already occurred. Yet, one of your recent articles that I believe was from January was about how Anadarko has eclipsed its oil and gas production record in Colorado.
Yeah, they reported their earnings for, they're a Houston-based company, of course, and they reported their earnings for 2018, the fourth quarter, and then the year total. And in the fourth quarter, their daily average production rate, which, if I remember correctly, was 285,000 barrels of oil and gas equivalents a day, was the highest that they've reported for the Denver-Julesburg Basin. And that's a result of the fact that what we've been talking about, these new strategies in drilling, they are resulting in high yield wells, particularly when they're relatively new and fresh. A lot of those wells are coming online. And so companies that, yes, there's a lot of headlines and there's a lot of controversy, but companies are still out there drilling. Oil prices were pretty healthy through the first two-thirds of last year. And it led a lot of companies to say now's the time. And I think in the longer view of 5 years, there's companies, making investments now, bringing wells online now, and I don't think that record that Anadarko put up as far as quarterly production is going to stand very long. I think it'll probably be more next year.
Be eclipsed again?
Well, they said they were going to bring 250 new wells in the Denver-Julesburg Basin online this year. That's their goal.
Wow.
That's just Anadarko. We have quarterly and year-end financial reports coming up for other big players in the basin, and I wouldn't be surprised if many of them have production records. The drilling advances have yielded wells that are particularly in the core of the DJ that are more productive than ever, really, as best I've heard.
Well, Peter, I think it speaks to the point that you were making earlier about technology.
Yeah, I don't know the details of this, but I feel very, very safe in saying, compared to 5 years ago, those 250 wells would be much more production, far fewer wells, much less land impact, shorter time that the wells are actually on pad, and road and dust and trucks will be reduced, and I would suspect that many of the wells are being drilled by quiet rigs, meaning electric rigs.
Yeah, that was something actually Anadarko did mention in their earnings, is that they're committing to doing nothing but quiet fleet fracking operations throughout Colorado.
Which that's actually one of the major objections. If you have something on site and it's really loud and keeps you up at night, you can see how neighbors get upset. But in one of our northern communities, I think this was a DBJ article probably about a year and a half ago, they were trying to make the point, and the neighbor was on the fence looking at the well and said, "When's it going to start?" And the operator said something along the lines, "It's been running for 3 weeks."
Yeah, they are quite different, and it was a relatively rare technology. You still don't hear about it being used as much in other basins as you do in Colorado, but it's because we have a population closer to the basin than
well, the social license is requiring it. It's changing. It's changing all the time.
As a technology reporter, since you've covered this for so long, is there something on the horizon that we don't know about yet? I mean, obviously, I don't want you to spoil your own stories here, but are there innovations out there that people are unaware of that could make a difference in terms of this debate?
Well, I think so. There are, and I've already written about this, so I'm not scooping myself, but there are innovations that, as a former tech reporter, there's artificial intelligence and big data technologies being brought to bear on big oil field operations that after the drilling is done, the wells are being operated with a lot of big data inputs and automation of how the wells vent and flare, and if there's flaring. how those things go on in relation to each other across a large expanse of wells is being driven by computers in some companies now increasingly, and the tests that some companies have done have shown that it dramatically decreases the amount of emissions that an oil field puts out overall. And then rather than having somebody in the field going around turning wrenches and opening valves and doing things as, you know, kind of reactive to data that the oil company is getting out of the field, they are automating switches on wells. And not every company can do this. Not all companies have the resources yet. But I think over time it'll become much more common to see oil field operations automated, and the amount of emissions reduction that companies like BP have started to see in some of their test plots where they've been doing is significant. And I think when we talk about social license to operate, willing to invest in things like pipelines and getting trucks off roads, and willing to invest in things like automation to help make operations more financially efficient and reduce emissions, that really helps you make a claim to that social license, I think, in the long run. So I think it's a big change. It may take a long time, and there's a lot of hype surrounding it, as there always is with technology.
Well, there are a lot of, I guess, economic motivations, too, beyond the environment, because that which previously was emitted can be sold.
Right.
And I saw one of the professors, actually it was a Johns Hopkins guy that came out to Colorado and was talking about this topic. And, you know, and he was talking about the automation and the sensors in the oil field, but he's talking about drones. And he says, let's find out exactly where it is and fix it right now.
Right.
And apparently drones are very good at that, and they're not expensive.
And it is interesting to see the industry invest in ways to find methane gas emissions. I mean, they have an incentive beyond just being a good operator,
right.
You know, from an environmental standpoint, but, you know, a good financial investment in knowing what's operating well and what's not.
So the idea of robots, it's right here, right now. It's not only in cars, it's in the oil field, and these vague, more sensors, automatic, you know, and greater intelligence. It's robots.
Yeah.
They're robots.
Even in the oil field.
In the oil field.
Well, pivoting a little bit, we're talking about technology. Governor Polis was recently sworn in, you know, just about a month ago. And one of his campaign goals was to transition Colorado to 100% renewable energy by, I can't even remember the date, 2040, something like that.
Yeah, I think so.
One of vital for Colorado's missions is to support all of the above. And as far as wind and solar go, that is typically bundled with natural gas in order, you know, for power generation, because natural gas is a reliable backup source. You cover also the renewables industry. Has the renewables industry been touched by this tension with oil and gas? And follow-up question, what can we look for from renewables coming up here in the near future?
Well, I think as we were talking about during the break, you had Alice Jackson on, who's the president of Excel Colorado. The biggest utilities are switching over the next 6-8 years to having a lot less coal, a lot more wind, a bunch of solar. Battery storage is coming into play and whatnot and being tested with, but also a huge part of that mix is natural gas. And part of that, you know, there are environmentalists who a few years ago were saying it's a bridge fuel, and that's all it is. And we'll see. Time will tell. But for now, oil and gas drilling has made, domestic oil and gas drilling has made natural gas so cheap that it is more economic to run natural gas plants than it is coal plants. And in the renewables end, wind and solar are now cheaper than investing in new coal plants. So the industry has shifted just in the space of a couple of years, where the economics have been completely inverted to what they were just a few years ago. And what we're getting out of it is cleaner, well, eventually, a lot of these systems aren't online yet, but some huge wind projects have come online in the past few months. A decade from now, there will be far less of the electricity we use on the Front Range generated by coal. It'll be natural gas, solar, wind. Wind will be the dominant generator for big stretches of the year, which is going to, I think it'll be hard for some people to get their head around how big of a shift it is, but we won't know. I mean, presumably if Excel does things right in the way they've planned it, our lights will go on, and our batteries will charge up and things like that the way they always have, but we will be doing so a lot cleaner. And it's baked into their plan. I mean, this isn't aspirational. This is what they're investing money in and will have coming online. It's pretty impressive.
I saw a presentation by Alice Jackson when she was being introduced to some aspects of the business community, and the numbers that I recall were something like 55% in terms of renewable portfolio.
Right. And that's not counting natural gas. When I first saw that number, I thought, are you counting natural gas in that? No, they're not. I mean,
and she explained that, but she also explained that low cost, long-term reliability, wind blows, sun doesn't shine, wind doesn't blow, and then she finally got down to the importance of natural gas plants. And some of these natural gas plants can start in 20 minutes, and they're actually dormant, and they're just sitting there, and they're sitting there for the point in time that when the load needs that input. And she said, I believe that 20% in the foreseeable future must be natural gas. And so she said, 55% things are changing, and it's radical, and all this new technology. And Xcel is investing in something like 50 technology companies. It has its own venture capital arm. It's working. Costs is coming down. But she basically said those that think the natural gas is going away, she didn't say they're smoking dope or anything like that, but she basically said, not my future.
Well, and it was interesting. I spoke with her and the CEO of Xcel Energy, Ben Folks, when they announced that the company was going to go even beyond that plan of 55% renewables to eliminating, the goal is to eliminate carbon emissions by 2050 across all of Xcel, not just in Colorado, but there are, I think, 8 states that they operate in, which is a pretty ambitious thing for a company that relies a lot on natural gas and coal, still to this day. And part of the reason for them not saying like the governor did, which is we want to go 100% renewable, they're saying we're going 100% carbon emissions free, is that they believe that there will be technologies to make natural gas virtually emissions free, if not emissions free completely, and then coal, possibly clean coal technologies that have been talked about a lot, and sequestration maybe. They don't know. Xcel doesn't claim to know what the technologies will be, but that they believe that investing in trying to find them will yield zero carbon emissions for power generation, which is a big shift.
It's very important, though. She said the same thing during our presentation, but zero carbon emissions does not mean no use of hydrocarbons.
Right. It does not mean no fossil fuels.
They're totally different ideas.
They are, and I don't know if at some point they'll
mix them up.
They do. I think people interchange 100% renewables with 100% carbon emissions free, and they don't have to be the same thing. I mean, we're not there yet, but Xcel was pretty optimistic that you get 80% carbon emissions reduction on technology we can see that are in development and being deployed now, and that final 20% is what the future technologies will bring out. And
so it sounds like you heard the same 80-20 endpoint in the near future.
Yeah, they were pretty explicit with that in their announcement in December about going to carbon emissions free, and that got a lot of attention around the country because they were the first major investor-owned utility to make a promise as bold as 100% carbon free at any definable point in the future.
So wouldn't you think that Governor Poehler ought to follow the lead of Xcel and not say something inconsistent?
I think he has a constituent that he's talking for. He's talking for. So he's
gonna politics.
He's gonna try and move the goalposts to where he wants them to be, not where they are, I guess.
Fantastic insights, Greg. Where can people find more about you? Where can they find your articles? Feel free to plug the Denver Business Journal. Where can we find you?
You can find the Denver Business Journal in your mailbox if you subscribe. That's my favorite way for you to get it. But go to www. Denver Business Journal. You can Google it.
You can get there through denverbusinessjournal.com. That's not going to be the address that comes up.
I think it's BizJournals.
It is BizJournals/Denver. www.bizjournals.com/Denver is our URL. Thank you for reminding me. I have a bookmark, so I never type it in.
For more about Vital for Colorado, go to www.vitalforcolorado.com. You can find our pledge there. You can find a list of our members. Peter Moore is on that site, as well as all these podcasts. Go to the Learn tab, look under videos and podcasts. Greg Avery, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Peter. Pleasure.
Thanks, Greg.